The interrogation chamber smelled of cold metal and ozone. Sterile lights flickered above, casting harsh shadows across the room. In the center, bound by energy restraints, sat the human. He was battered, bloodied, and bruised, but his eyes still burned with a defiant intensity that unsettled Captain Valon. She had interrogated countless prisoners before, traitors, spies, even seasoned warriors, but never had she encountered something like this. This human had been captured after a brutal skirmish on the outer fringes of the Galactic Dominion. His unit had been wiped out. His ship had been turned to molten wreckage. His bones were likely shattered in a dozen places. And yet, he sat there, exuding something that should not exist in his condition. Not fear. Not despair. But amusement. Valon clenched her jaw, flicking her clawed fingers over the control console. The restraints tightened, glowing bright as they pressed down on his body. "Do you understand your situation, human?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. He tilted his head slightly, the corner of his lip twitching, not in pain but in something else. "Yeah," he said. "You're trying to scare me." Her second eyelids flicked over her golden irises in surprise. Most species in this position would already be broken, sobbing, pleading. Yet he looked at her like she was the one on the wrong side of this situation. "Do you know what happens next?" she pressed. "You're gonna try to make me afraid," he said casually, rolling his shoulders as if the restraints were a minor inconvenience. "And then you're gonna be very disappointed." Valon exhaled sharply. "You should be afraid. Do you understand what our species does to prisoners of war?" "Yeah," he said again, voice calm. "But I also understand what fear does to people. And you see, Captain, I don't scare easy." His pulse should have been erratic. His voice should have trembled. His breathing should have been shallow. Instead, he was stable. Valon had no patience for mind games. Her talons tapped the controls, sending a pulse of pain through his restraints. His body seized momentarily, muscles locking up, yet his eyes never lost that unnerving steadiness. When the pulse ended, he exhaled through gritted teeth. Then he chuckled. Valon took an involuntary step back. That sound, low, rough, unbroken, felt unnatural coming from a prisoner. It was a sound she associated with victors. "What," she whispered, "is so amusing?" The human leaned forward as much as the restraints allowed. His voice dropped just above a whisper. "You think this is scary?" His smile was slow, deliberate. "Lady, you have no idea what real fear looks like." Valon's breath caught, because for the first time in her career, she felt it. Valon's claws twitched at her sides. The interrogation chamber, once a place where she commanded absolute control, now felt different. The air was wrong. It wasn't the scent of ozone or blood. It was him. The human. Still grinning. Still fearless. She had heard stories of their kind, tales whispered between Dominion officers. Tales that sounded too absurd to be true. That humans did not break the way other species did. That they did not beg when pressed. That fear functioned differently for them. She had dismissed such nonsense. Now, looking into the eyes of this battered, broken man, she wasn't so sure anymore. Her fingers danced across the control panel. The restraints tightened further, enough to elicit an involuntary grunt from him. Yet his smirk remained. "You claim to know fear," she said, her voice steady despite the strange unease curling in her gut. "Then tell me, what do you fear, human?" He exhaled slowly, shifting slightly against the restraints. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Try me." His grin widened. "All right, Captain. You want to know what really scares me?" He leaned forward as much as the energy bonds allowed. For the first time, his voice dropped to something darker. Something deeper. "I'm afraid of what happens when my people get here." Silence. A cold, suffocating silence that swallowed the room whole. Valon didn't blink. She processed his words carefully, weighing them against everything she knew. His fleet was gone. His unit destroyed. There were no reinforcements coming. Yet he believed they were. "You're lying," she said, though the certainty in her voice faltered. "Your fleet is dust. Your commanders are dead." The human inhaled slowly. "See, that's the thing about humans," he murmured. "You don't get us, do you?" Valon stiffened. "Other species fight wars to win," he continued. "We fight wars so you lose." A prickle of unease crawled down the back of her spine. "You think I'm here alone?" he asked. "You think my people will let this slide?" He chuckled low and slow. "Captain, we don't do acceptable losses. We don't do strategic retreats." He leaned back slightly, rolling his shoulders despite the agony he must have felt. "What scares me," he said, his voice like a storm rolling over the horizon, is that you don't understand what's about to happen to you. Vaylon's hands curled into fists. This was impossible. Psychological manipulation. That was the only explanation. She opened her mouth to respond. Then the emergency sirens howled. Red lights flashed in rapid succession. The Dominion's warning klaxons screamed across the base. A static-filled voice crackled through the intercom. Unidentified vessels detected. Repeat, multiple human warships inbound. Vaylon's blood ran cold. Slowly she turned back to the human. He was grinning again. But this time it wasn't amusement. It was triumph. Vaylon's claws hovered over her wrist communicator, her mind scrambling for control. Human warships? That was impossible. The Dominion had shattered their fleet cycles ago. Their reinforcements were gone, reduced to drifting wreckage in the void. No distress signals had been set. No hyperspace anomalies had been detected. Yet the alarms wailed. Yet the human still smiled. She forced herself to push down the unease curling in her gut. Her voice was steady when she pressed the communicator. This is Captain Vaylon. Status report, now. A burst of static crackled before her second-in-command's voice came through, strained with barely controlled panic. Captain, unknown warships just dropped out of FTL. They're human. How many? The hesitation made her stomach tighten. All of them. She hissed under her breath. Clarify. The officer's voice was nearly a whisper. Every orbital sensor just lit up with human signatures. It's not a fleet. It's a conquest force. The temperature in the room plummeted. She turned back to the human. His expression hadn't changed, only deepened. The grin was still there, but now it carried something else. Not just amusement. Not just triumph. Certainty. Vaylon exhaled sharply. You're bluffing. The human chuckled, stretching as much as the energy restraints allowed. You really think so? She clenched her jaw. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Oh. Even if some human warships had survived their destruction, they should have been fractured, scattered, without cohesion. They should have been lost, disorganized, easy to pick off one by one. A full-scale retaliation should have been impossible. Yet. Her communicator crackled again. Captain, we have visual. The line cut to screaming. Then static. Vaylon froze. The silence after was more terrifying than the alarms. The human exhaled through his nose as if in deep satisfaction. That would be the boarding ships. She snapped her gaze back to him. That's impossible, she growled, her voice low. The human tilted his head slightly. You think we wouldn't come back for one of our own? He asked as if genuinely curious. Vaylon's blood ran cold. Before she could reply, the walls shook. The ground lurched. The entire base rumbled as something massive impacted its exterior. The lights flickered, and for the first time in her military career, a Dominion facility's reinforced walls screamed. Then came the detonations. One after another. Controlled. Precise. She knew what they were before her sensors even confirmed it. Breach charges. Vaylon sucked in a sharp breath. It wasn't just a bombardment. It wasn't just an orbital attack. The humans weren't here to destroy the facility. They were coming inside. The restraints holding the human flickered and deactivated. Her heart nearly stopped. Vaylon's eyes snapped to the control panel, but her fingers barely reached it before the entire system went dark. Disabled. The human rolled his shoulders, stretching lazily as he stood. She had never felt more vulnerable in her life. How? She started. A single, deafening boom cut her off. The reinforced doors to the interrogation room exploded inward. A storm of smoke and metal filled the chamber, followed by armored figures. They moved like ghosts, quick, precise, predatory. Vaylon barely registered the weapons aimed at her before one of them stepped forward. He wasn't the largest among them, nor the most heavily armored. But she felt it. A presence. A weight in the air. This wasn't just any human soldier. This was something worse. Something legendary. Vaylon swallowed hard. The newly freed prisoner grinned wider and stepped toward his rescuer, clapping the man's armored shoulder. Took you long enough. The soldier barely turned his helmeted head. You always did have a bad habit of getting caught, Mason. Mason chuckled. Had to make sure they were all here before we dropped in. Wouldn't want them running off. The soldier's helmet turned slightly toward Vaylon. She felt something she hadn't in cycles. Dread. The soldier's voice was calm. Measured. We're done talking. Vaylon didn't even have time to react before darkness took her. Captain Vaylon's vision blurred as she fought to stay conscious. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was the human soldier's helmet turning toward her, his presence heavy as a warship's hull pressing down on her chest. Then, nothing. She awoke to chaos. A deep, rhythmic pounding reverberated through the base. Muffled shouts. The screech of Dominion alarms. Somewhere close, weapons discharged in bursts, followed by the guttural screams of dying warriors. Her instincts screamed at her. Mo. Vaylon's hands shot to her belt. Her weapons were gone. Of course they were. She had been taken. Her breath came fast. Her mind recalibrated. The air smelled wrong. Heavy. Thick. Explosives. Plasma burns. Blood. She turned her head. Humans. The prisoner, Mason, sat on a nearby crate, arms crossed over his chest. He was no longer restrained, no longer amused. Now he just looked bored. The other human, the armored one, the leader, stood near the entrance of the chamber listening to something in his earpiece. His body was perfectly still, yet poised, coiled like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. She recognized that kind of stillness. Not arrogance. Not recklessness. Control. Vaylon forced her voice steady. What do you want? Mason smirked. Now that, he said, stretching lazily, is a complicated question. The soldier cut in, his tone razor-sharp. No, he said. It's not. The way he spoke made her skin crawl. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't anger. It was certainty. Like he already knew how this would end. Mason leaned back, resting his weight on his palms. We came to collect something, he said lightly. Vaylon's jaw clenched. The human's grin widened. And by something, I mean you. Her breath hitched. Then, before she could react, the entire chamber shook. The Dominion base, her base, was crumbling. She wasn't sure what was more terrifying, the explosions shaking the foundations or the calm in the humans' movements as if they had planned every moment of this. Mason cracked his neck. Showtime. The armored soldier turned toward her, his helmet reflecting the emergency lights. Your fleet is gone, he said. Your base is compromised. You have two options, Captain. Vaylon's claws twitched. The soldier lifted a single gloved hand. One, you fight. You die. He extended a second finger. Two, you come with us. The ground lurched, another detonation. The Dominion's defenses were failing. She had been on battlefields before. She had watched worlds burn. She had won wars. But this wasn't a war. This was an execution. Mason sighed, standing. We really don't have time for this. The lights flickered. The sounds of battle diminished. Not because the fight was ending. Because the Dominion was losing. Vaylon had never felt so small. Her fleet was gone. Her forces were overwhelmed. The humans hadn't just come to fight. They had come to erase. Her throat was dry. Why? She managed. The soldier's helmet tilted slightly. Because, he said, his voice quiet but impossibly heavy, you made the mistake of thinking we wouldn't come back. Then, before she could react, something slammed into the back of her skull. Everything went dark. She awoke somewhere else. Cold metal beneath her. The hum of a ship's engines. Human voices, distant but clear. The restraints were gone. She sat up. A viewport stretched across the far wall. What she saw made her stomach twist. Dominion space, burning. Human ships moved like shadows, swift and unstoppable. Her people's warships were nothing but debris. Her world was gone. The humans had taken everything. A presence moved beside her. She turned. Mason was grinning. So, he said, welcome to the real war. Vaylon exhaled. And for the first time in her life, she understood fear. The end. Want more stories like this? Subscribe for more. Rocket Fire.